She had always known that beauty was a sharper weapon than any knife, more persuasive than any speech, and more expensive than any jewel, and she had learned early on to measure smiles to the millimeter, to dose her glances, to calibrate the tone of her voice as if adjusting a lens to capture precisely what she wanted. For her, the world never offered tenderness for free, and that was how she understood that seduction was not romance, it was strategy, and that sweet promises served less to fill a heart and more to unlock safes that would never belong to her. Poverty knocked at her door with the constancy of rain on the roof, and every frustration accumulated like faded photographs of birthdays without cake, of improvised gifts, of dreams folded and stored in drawers that jammed. She grew up watching debts stack up on empty shelves, watching the electricity bill overdue, watching the refrigerator turn into a mirror for lack of occupation, and she turned all of it into fuel for the coldness that began to form like an invisible crust beneath her skin, hardening with every no she received, with every door that would not open, with every look that reduced her to the pretty girl who would be lucky if she managed to marry someone with a future. Luck, she realized, was a luxury reserved for the naive, and she decided that the future had to be clawed out with nails, with calculation, and with patience, building a character that looked at everyone else as pieces on a board, where the only valid rule was victory. There was in her a magnetism that crossed the street before her body did, a presence that halted conversations and stirred silent comparisons. But what made her dangerous was not the symmetrical face or the almost sculptural features. It was her ability to study fissures in other people's character with the precision of a surgeon, discovering where it hurt, where something was lacking, where vanity, longing, or loneliness overflowed, and slipping the bait into that exact spot. She trained her ear to catch weaknesses in quick confessions, in prolonged laughter, in memories told as if apologizing to the past, and she collected stories of men who thought themselves immune to their own desire until the very minute they found themselves standing before her, calculating all they might lose while her perfume still clouded their reason. She also learned that pity was a delay, that regret was a waste, and that hesitation was an invitation for someone sharper to close the deal of the day. So, she did not hesitate, she did not retreat, she did not blink. When a friend told her she seemed cruel, she smiled faintly and thought that life had been cruel first, long before, and that the tears that once dried without an embrace had given her the bitter blessing of never asking permission again. And in that logic, men came and went like rumors. One who swore to marry and disappeared the following week, another who promised a job and, at the first concrete request, warned that things were difficult. She stored names, addresses, and intentions in a mental notebook, marking each lesson with the clarity of a map, until she concluded that it was not enough to have an occasional target. She needed a goal that would change the scale of her life, that would rearrange the board, that would pull her out of the spiral where she was born poor and would die tired. And it was then that she heard about him, the billionaire who seemed unattainable, the man who needed nothing and, precisely for that reason, seemed to possess everything she wanted to conquer at once: status, security, open doors, a surname that transformed any small room into a ballroom. Before daring to approach, however, she polished her character with almost religious discipline. She studied routines, memorized preferences, mapped habits, traced paths of indirect access, as if preparing for a role in a film worth the highest award. She changed her wardrobe without flaunting it immediately. Neutral colors, precise cuts, fabrics that draped well over her body like a request for silence. She controlled the way she laughed, calibrating the sound to seem natural, and she tested before the mirror 3 versions of that gaze that said, "I understand you," without seeming pleading. She created a strategic biography with carefully filled gaps, not too poor so as not to inspire pity, not too well off so as not to seem self-sufficient. She let slip carefully chosen stories about a past of small challenges overcome, avoiding exaggerated tragedies that would sound like traps, and she built an emotional repertoire capable of adapting quickly to the day's conversation. She discreetly researched circles of acquaintances, identified who held the keys to introductions, detected the rise and fall of certain friendships, and placed herself in the passing line of a common acquaintance. because she knew that to reach the inaccessible, the first step is rarely frontal, almost always lateral. And when she finally managed to have her name reach his ears, she did not celebrate. She simply drew a line on her mental board and moved on to stage 2, as someone who switches tools after finishing the first phase of a work that does not allow improvisation. It was at this stage that coldness acquired the contours of a method. She did not merely want to start a romance with him. She wanted to ensure bonds that would withstand the tide of his moods, his suspicions, and his schedule. And she realized that the oldest illusion in the world still worked like an irresistible spell at any table. The prospect of an heir, of a destiny sealed by a bond of blood, of an irreversible future that seizes a man through responsibility and vanity at the same time. The so-called pregnancy trick was not for her an immoral anecdote, but a project with stages, deadlines, and margins of risk carefully calculated. And she set about, without remorse, drawing each point of this script, the right moment to insinuate maturity, the convenient instant to display domestic sweetness, the precise hour to appear vulnerable without appearing fragile. She researched clinics, forums, disguising tricks, devices that imitated heartbeats, testimonies of women who, in difficult times, had done the impossible to survive, and she separated what was legend from what was applicable, constructing a silent arsenal that included everything from anatomically filled pillows to medical justifications that sounded plausible in quick conversations. She rehearsed questions and answers before the mirror, so as not to be caught in contradiction, read about symptoms, memorized schedules, studied tracking spreadsheets. 8 weeks, 12, 16, learned the vocabulary. That would make her performance believable to distracted ears, and she designed the exact moment of the announcement, not as an outburst of joy, but as an intimate confidence, one that gives the man the illusion of having been chosen to guard a precious secret before the whole world, creating the perfect ground for him to feel part of something greater than himself. None of this, however, would have force if she did not master the art of appearing both inevitable and rare. With each step, she built an atmosphere where her presence was synonymous with calm, with order, with someone who knows how to enter and leave without making noise, how to fix without asking for credit, how to appear without stealing the light. A woman who does not invade, but occupies with gentleness, and who, by occupying, transforms the space without anyone noticing, wrapping everyday life in tissue paper that gives everything an aspect of care. When he passed by, she did not surround him. She only positioned herself where she could be noticed without effort, offering short phrases, listening attentively, accepting silences as part of the conversation, and not as a failure in communication. And it was in this way that, brick by brick, she approached not the fortune, but the territory where his defenses were most human. Memories of losses, fatigue carved into difficult decisions, friendships that had sunk in the tide of interests. And this territory, she knew, demanded light steps. And if at some point her conscience whispered that all this crossed the lines of compassion, she replied mentally that she was not the first to learn from the hardness of the world, and that if there was guilt in this story, it dissolved in the fact that everyone, sooner or later, defends what they believe they deserve. The difference, in her case, was that she would not wait to deserve, she would take, with all the care and calculation of someone who had already drawn the escape route before even entering the party. And as soon as the first message was answered, as the first conversation shifted from formality to a faint interest, as the first coffee shared an almost casual smile, she realized that the great door does not burst open with pushes. It opens millimeter by millimeter, and a single millimeter was enough for her to swear, in silence, that from there she would not retreat a single centimeter. He was the kind of man who drew silence into a room before even uttering a word, because his mere presence carried the weight of an empire. His clear eyes, an almost metallic shade of blue, seemed to see through people, even when he avoided fixing them for too long. And his body, forged through years of discipline and training, was a living monument to strength and power. Nothing in his life happened by chance. Every decision was calculated, every step was studied, every victory was conquered with the conviction of someone born never to lose. His fortune was not merely inheritance, It was the product of a mind that turned numbers into strategies and opportunities into empires. He was not only a billionaire in his bank account, but also in the gaze of women who dreamed of being chosen, in the businessmen who trembled across his negotiating table, and in the rivals who hated his silent arrogance. At every appearance, the spotlight sought his image, yet nothing could pierce the invisible wall he had built around his heart. That man was, to everyone, unattainable. The world saw a Greek god in modern attire, sculpted muscles, broad shoulders, the bearing of a warrior and the posture of a king. But behind that almost mythological facade lay a soul marked by invisible scars. He had loved and been betrayed, had extended trust to those who only desired his wealth, had opened doors that became traps. He had learned early that being desired did not mean being loved, and that the beauty surrounding him was nothing more than a reflection of what his fortune could buy. This awareness turned his heart to stone and his routine into iron discipline. He rose early, trained like a gladiator, closed million-dollar deals, and at night isolated himself in a silent mansion that resembled a fortress more than a home. The cold walls, adorned with priceless works of art, bore witness to a loneliness he would never confess. For admitting need would be the same as arming his enemies. He needed no one. At least, that was what he repeated every morning in front of the mirror. He had the world at his feet. Cars that provoked envy, yachts that cut seas like blades, companies that dominated entire sectors. But when the lights went out, what remained was a heavy emptiness, a vast bed occupied only by his gigantic body, and a mind that, no matter how much it distracted itself with victories, could not silence the echo of an incomplete life. The relationships he had tried were shallow, driven by interest or illusions that quickly crumbled. Fame had given him too many women, but not one who dared to look at him as a man instead of an asset. And it was precisely this absence of truth that made him inaccessible, surrounded by perfect faces. Yet, all the same, he shielded himself more and more, becoming an untouchable myth, an unbreakable fortress, an impossible prize. In society, he was seen as a trophy. Women approached with rehearsed laughter. Families treated him as an opportunity for ascension. Friends divided themselves between flatterers and false allies. He perceived it all, every intention hidden behind polite words, and this only fed his disbelief in love and in people. Perhaps deep down, he hoped that one day something real might appear, but he no longer believed it possible. His trust was like a wall too high to climb, and his heart, a territory where no one dared to step anymore. This handsome, extraordinary, ultra-muscular and coveted billionaire was, above all, a lonely man. And that loneliness, though he would never admit it, was his greatest weakness. Her mind worked like a chessboard, where every piece had a movement calculated with almost mathematical coldness. And before the colossal image of that unattainable billionaire, the woman understood that she needed to devise something greater than simple seduction. Winning over a man like him would not be possible with beauty alone, since all his life he had been surrounded by faces as perfect as hers, women ready to throw themselves into his arms for status or convenience. No, it required something that would bind him, that would chain him in an unbreakable bond, a tie that would make him believe he had obligations beyond fleeting passion. And it was through this cold, calculating reasoning that the plan of the pregnancy trick began to take shape in her mind, like a stage play that demanded preparation, rehearsal, and perfection in every detail. She spent sleepless nights researching ways to make the lie unquestionable. She watched videos of pregnant women, studied the typical symptoms of pregnancy, read medical articles, and memorized the physical changes that should appear over the months. She even bought sophisticated prototypes of fake bellies, made of malleable silicone, capable of fooling even a careless touch. She created a fictitious schedule of medical appointments, fabricated forged test results, prepared confirmation messages so that when questioned, she could present quick evidence, reinforcing the act. She left no room for chance. Every response that could be demanded was already written in her mind. Simulated nausea at strategic times, carefully staged food cravings, fabricated rest during specific afternoons. Her body, still young and healthy, would be the canvas upon which she would paint the greatest fraud of her life. But such a daring plan required more than technical details. It demanded perfect timing. She could not throw herself into the lie immediately, for he, suspicious by nature, would notice. First, he had to believe in the romance, had to grow accustomed to her presence, had to begin to see her as a possible companion. So she crafted an emotional schedule. The first dates would awaken curiosity, the next one's admiration, and only when he began to yield to his own barriers would she drop the bomb of an unexpected pregnancy. At that moment, he could not simply withdraw, for his sense of responsibility, so well known and much discussed in social circles, would force him to stay. The billionaire who had never bowed before anyone would finally find himself chained to her, not by love, but by duty, and that was exactly what she wanted, to turn his virtue into a trap. Behind this strategy, however, lay an even darker motivation: revenge against the world that had humiliated her. For her, it was not only about becoming rich, but about proving that beauty and cunning were enough weapons to turn the game of life. She remembered the days when she asked for credit at the market, the hidden laughter of neighbors who judged her as a pretty girl with no future, and every detail of the poverty that surrounded her was fuel feeding her desire to become untouchable. By imagining herself beside the billionaire, pregnant with the heir everyone would celebrate, she felt finally avenged, triumphant, glorified before those who once belittled her. Her plan was not only about him, it was about showing the world that she, the poor and forgotten woman, would be capable of capturing the man everyone considered impossible. And so, with the pregnancy scheme drawn in every detail, she prepared for the next phase, the first direct contact. There was no room for hesitation or mistakes. She was convinced that a well-constructed lie would become more real than any truth, and that before a perfect performance, even the hardest man would eventually give in. It was the beginning of a silent war between illusion and distrust, and she was ready to use every weapon, every smile, every calculated tear to win. The chessboard was set, and the next piece would be moved with a precision capable of changing both of their destinies forever. The meeting did not happen by chance, although he believed it did. She had already studied in detail the places he frequented, the times he appeared, the details of his routine that seemed random, but that, to her, formed a precious map. She chose the moment with the coldness of a military strategist. It could not be at a luxurious party, where he would be surrounded by flatterers, nor at a business meeting, where his gaze was shielded like steel. It needed to be in a public yet informal space, where coincidence could be convincing and his vulnerability real. Thus, she positioned herself precisely at the discreet cafe where he liked to have his espresso after the gym, a simple place by the standards of his fortune, but one that represented a breath of air in his armored routine. She entered the place as someone who was not seeking attention, but inevitably she conquered it. Her dress was sober, yet highlighted her curves. Her loose hair fell in studied waves, simulating carelessness. Her eyes, always intense, seemed to float between innocence and mystery. She carried a book in her hands, a detail carefully chosen to create an image of depth, something that contrasted with the women he was used to seeing in party outfits and empty conversations. She sat nearby without seeming invasive, and within minutes staged the first act. She deliberately let her bag fall, scattering a few papers across the floor. Instinctively, he bent down to help her. At that instant, his eyes met hers, and the first visual contact was as brief as it was calculated, yet enough to plant the seed. The conversation emerged as if it was not meant to last. She thanked him with a sweet, unforced smile, and casually commented on the book she held, insinuating an affinity with subjects he would never have expected from a stranger. The billionaire, accustomed to superficial dialogues, was surprised to realize that in front of him was a woman who knew how to lead words with intelligence and ease. She did not exaggerate with compliments, did not try to impress him with theatrical gestures. On the contrary, she left gaps, small pauses that made him feel curious, drawn by the sensation that there was more than the eyes could capture. He, who always maintained an invisible wall before strangers, found himself, against his own nature, prolonging the dialogue. The way she tilted her head while listening, how she smiled with sobriety instead of laughing loudly, how she seemed interested without being needy, all of it formed a pleasant enigma, something he did not find in the women who surrounded him. The meeting ended simply, with a cordial farewell, but within him something had moved, a spark of curiosity that would leave him thinking of her more than he would like to admit. For her, the first act was complete. She did not need declarations or immediate invitations. She knew that the secret of desire was absence, and as she walked out the cafe's door, she felt the silent victory pulse within her. The unattainable billionaire now had her face imprinted in his mind. The first piece had been placed on the chessboard, and the game was officially in motion. After the first encounter, she knew she should not throw herself into hasty advances. The secret lay in measuring absence and presence with almost scientific precision. She allowed a few days to pass before reappearing, by coincidence, at another point in his routine, always calculating the moments as though moving pieces on an invisible chessboard. On these occasions, she never forced closeness, only offered brief and natural conversations, leaving in the air the impression that the universe itself conspired to bring them together. This game of subtleties slowly built a bond that, to outside eyes, seemed born of chance, but was in reality the product of cold, calculated manipulation. He, in turn, began to notice the frequency of these coincidences, but instead of becoming suspicious, he felt intrigued. It was as if that woman had appeared to fill a gap in his routine. She knew how to listen, knew how to laugh at the right moment, knew how to remain silent when the conversation required quiet, and every detail reinforced the image of someone different from the rest. A woman not obsessed with wealth or social prestige, but who conveyed a discreet charm, almost domestic, almost genuine. The billionaire, who always kept himself shielded against emotional invasions, began to lower his guard without realizing it. Dinners began to appear as casual invitations. First, in discreet restaurants, then at social events where he appeared officially, already allowing her to be seen by his side. The world noticed, commented, speculated. Who was this stranger, now walking beside the most desired man? She, always attentive, shaped her posture to perfection, elegant but not arrogant, smiling but never vulgar, affectionate but not submissive. The role of the ideal girlfriend was being performed masterfully, and each gesture strengthened the theater she had carefully planned. Yet it was all appearance. Behind the loving glances and public displays of affection, there was no genuine tenderness in her heart. There was only calculation. Every step she took at his side was measured by the utility it had within the grand plan. When he smiled, she smiled twice as much. When he showed fatigue, she appeared as the perfect balm. And when he spoke of business, she listened with feigned attention, memorizing expressions to repeat later as if they were her own opinions. This game of mirrors enchanted him, for it gave him the illusion that he had found a companion who truly understood him. The romance of appearances grew like a flame visible to all but invisible in its essence. While society began to see her as the billionaire's new woman, she was merely counting the days to take the next step. The stage was set, the curtains drawn, and the audience already applauding without realizing that everything was nothing more than an act. The love the world believed was blossoming was, in truth, the most dangerous of deceptions. And soon, she would reveal the centerpiece of her game, the fabricated pregnancy that would change everything. The moment she had rehearsed so many times had finally arrived. After weeks of feeding the romance of appearances, of becoming a constant presence at his side, and of being socially recognized as the woman who had conquered the heart of the unattainable billionaire, it was time to drop the bomb that would bind his hands in invisible chains. The supposed pregnancy. It could not be done abruptly, nor in a banal setting. It needed to be staged as an intimate secret, something delicate, something that gave him the impression he was the first to share in that revelation. Thus, she prepared everything with meticulous care. She chose a calm night, when business did not consume him and the atmosphere was lighter, and invited him to dinner at her home instead of a luxurious restaurant. She cooked something simple, simulating a gesture of genuine affection, and left the room lit only by candles, creating an aura of intimacy and trust. During dinner, she guided the conversation gently. She spoke about life, about the future, about how things had changed since they met. At a certain moment, she deliberately fell silent, letting the air grow heavy, until she sighed with an apparently vulnerable look. He, curious, pressed her with tenderness, asking what was wrong. That was when she released the phrase she had rehearsed thousands of times before the mirror. "I am pregnant." His reaction was immediate. His body stiffened, his gaze froze, his breath suspended. The billionaire who faced ruthless competitors and negotiated billions without blinking now found himself paralyzed before a single sentence. She, controlling even the tremor in her voice, held his hand and said she had not planned it, that it had happened, but that she could not be happier. The performance was perfect, and every tear rolling down her cheeks had been scripted for that moment. He did not respond immediately. The silence stretched almost suffocatingly, but when he finally spoke, it was to say that if it was true, he would do everything within his reach to take responsibility. The words she wanted to hear were spoken, and her heart pulsed with triumph. The plan was unfolding exactly as she had designed it. He did not embrace her at once, but the impact in his gaze was proof enough that the trap had worked. In the following days, he began to act as though he truly were a father. He called to ask how she was, questioned her about medical appointments, spoke of routine adjustments. Every gesture reinforced the sense that she had won. For the world, the announcement would come later, but she was already delighting in the idea of being the future mother of the most anticipated heir in social circles. Her friends envied her luck. The stares already saw her as a woman blessed by fortune and destiny. The pregnancy scheme was underway, and she saw herself closer and closer to a victory she believed to be definitive. But what she did not know was that, behind the billionaire's intense and silent eyes, a seed of suspicion had already begun to sprout, and that suspicion, though still discreet, would become the spark that ignited the ruin of her entire plan. When he heard the news of the supposed pregnancy, the billionaire felt as though the ground beneath his feet had given way for an instant. That man, accustomed to dealing with astronomical figures, million-dollar contracts, and decisions that changed the destiny of entire companies, suddenly found himself facing something no spreadsheet could calculate. Fatherhood had always been a delicate subject for him, for he carried within himself a mixture of hidden desire and profound fear. The desire to leave a legacy, to have an heir who would perpetuate his name and his story. The fear of repeating mistakes from the past, of entrusting himself to someone unworthy of his confidence. When the phrase "I am pregnant" echoed, it was as if all those feelings collided at once. In the days that followed, his routine began to change. He started waking earlier, not only to train or review contracts, but to call her and ask how she was doing. He began appearing in discreet pharmacies, buying vitamins and supplements he considered important. He sent flowers, even though he was not romantic by nature, as if trying, in his awkward way, to fill the emotional gap the news had opened in his life. In his eyes, there was a mixture of surprise and pride. In his gestures, the responsibility of a man who did not run from commitments. She knew how to manipulate this side of him, and every time she said she felt nauseous, tired, or in need of attention, he appeared ready to provide support. But at the same time that he dedicated himself with intensity, an unease began to circle him like a silent shadow. It was discreet, almost imperceptible, yet grew with each ill-fitting detail. An exam never shown in full, an appointment he could not attend, a malaise that appeared at times far too convenient. Nothing was enough to raise an accusation, but taken together, it formed a bothersome fog he could not disperse. Still, his initial stance was one of trust. He believed that if there was any doubt, it would be unjust to stain that moment with suspicion. After all, he had always been a man of his word, someone who did not retreat when life presented responsibilities. Society began to react to the news. Even without an official announcement, rumors spread quickly, and all eyes turned toward them. The idea that the most desired man was now to become a father multiplied conversations in business corridors, in social circles, and even in the press. He noticed the curious stares, the skewed congratulations, the whispered comments. In part, he felt pride. In part, he felt the crushing weight of public judgment. But he did not back down. On the contrary, he increasingly embraced the stance of a committed man, as though fatherhood were an invisible trophy he had to carry firmly. She, behind the mask of fragility, celebrated each of his gestures, believing the plan was consolidated. But what she did not perceive was that the billionaire, even while wrapped in gestures of care, was beginning to activate the analytical and calculating side that had made him unbeatable in business. He did not yet know exactly what he was searching for, but a silent voice within him repeated that something was not right. And that voice, timid at first, would soon transform into investigation, into doubt, into truth. When the rumors of the pregnancy finally crossed the walls of intimacy and spread throughout the social circle, his life became an even brighter showcase. The billionaire who had always cultivated discretion now found himself exposed in side conversations, discreet headlines, and comments at gala dinners. People who once looked at him with professional respect now approached him with smiles laden with second intentions, congratulating him as if the heir were already a consummated fact. The women who surrounded him with looks of desire retreated, some with envy, others with disdain for the lucky one who had supposedly captured the most unattainable man in the country. Business associates, many of them false allies, began to see the alleged pregnancy as a landmark that sealed not only his fate, but also market movements. After all, a child meant inheritance, contract changes, redefinitions of power. She, in turn, swam in glory. She paraded with a sparkle in her eyes that resembled triumph more than maternity. Every public appearance at his side was carefully orchestrated. Looser clothing to suggest a belly that did not yet exist, hands resting discreetly on her abdomen, timid smiles that hinted at maternal happiness. Women whispered, men commented, and suddenly she, who until recently had been only a stranger, had become the most talked about figure in high society. Being seen as the future mother of the heir transformed her status vertiginously. She was no longer just beautiful, she was powerful. But the pressure that for her meant victory, for him, was weight. At every event he attended, he felt the weight of expectations falling upon his shoulders. People congratulated him, and though he smiled, he carried within him a restlessness he shared with no one. The man accustomed to controlling everything was now seen as vulnerable, as someone who had finally been tamed. This idea circulated in malicious comments that reached his ears, and though he pretended indifference, something inside him corroded with that perception. Was he really being manipulated? Was he living an illusion staged to satisfy a desire that was not his own? With each passing day, doubt grew like a silent poison. Still, he stood firm in public. If there was one thing he hated, it was giving others a spectacle. He feigned pride, reinforced his posture as a family man, and even began to consider future projects that had never before crossed his mind. But at home, when night fell and the lights went out, the billionaire felt the echo of contradictions. Something did not add up, but the pressure of society was so overwhelming that any retreat, any hesitation, would sound like cowardice or irresponsibility, and he could not bear the idea of being seen as a weak man. Meanwhile, she continued fueling the performance, increasingly confident that the world already recognized her as the victor. She could not imagine that, behind his serious eyes, the billionaire's mind was working silently, calculating risks, reviewing details, hunting for flaws. Society applauded, but he was already preparing the stage for her downfall. To the eyes of the world, the charade remained flawless. She paraded as the future mother of the most coveted heir, and he upheld the image of a committed man, ready to embrace responsibilities. But deep within, something began to bother the billionaire like a small stone inside his shoe. At first, they were subtle details, almost imperceptible, that could easily be ignored. A medical exam that never reached his hands because, according to her, the doctor had requested discretion. An appointment scheduled precisely at a time when he had unavoidable commitments. A sudden nausea that appeared conveniently and disappeared too quickly when there was no audience. Everything seemed real at first glance, but in the mind of a man accustomed to dealing with lies and manipulations in business, those small flaws became warning signs. He began to observe more carefully without showing it. He paid attention to the tone of her voice, to her glances, to her automatic gestures. He noticed that when no one was watching, she forgot to touch her belly, something she made sure to emphasize in public. He also noticed that the supposed bump had no perceptible progression. Some days it looked larger, on others almost non-existent, as if the illusion itself swayed along with her moods. He questioned himself in silence. Was he exaggerating? Was he merely paranoid? But inside him, the intuition that had made him unbeatable in business now told him, insistently, that something was wrong. At a gala dinner, one detail became even more disturbing. One of the guests, a mother of 3, cheerfully commented on early pregnancy symptoms and asked the woman direct questions. She, though intelligent and manipulative, answered with insecurity, stumbling on details that any pregnant woman would know. The billionaire noticed. He smiled in public, but inside a fire began to burn. It was the first time he could not justify her inconsistencies to himself. Doubt ceased to be a shadow and became a constant presence. That night, lying in his enormous bed staring at the ceiling, he felt torn. Part of him wanted to believe he was about to become a father, that he would finally have a reason greater than fortune and business to wake up every morning. Another part, however, screamed that he was being used, deceived, manipulated in the lowest and cruelest way possible. This silent battle began to transform him. In public, he maintained the image of a confident man. In private, he became a cold investigator, recording every detail, every inconsistency, as though building an invisible dossier on the woman who slept by his side. For her, nothing seemed out of place. She believed her performance remained intact and that, if some flaws appeared, they were easily covered by the social theatre. She did not realize that little by little, the mask was beginning to crack before the eyes of a man who was used to seeing beyond appearances. The billionaire, the man no one could deceive in business, was now beginning to see that perhaps he was being deceived in matters of the heart. And once suspicion settles in someone like him, there is no turning back. Only the truth, naked and devastating, can resolve the equation. The billionaire, accustomed to dealing with figures, contracts, and rivals disguised as allies, knew that blind trust was a luxury he had never afforded in business. Now, faced with the inconsistencies of the woman who claimed to carry his child, he realized he needed to act as he always had in the corporate world. Investigate in silence, gather evidence, wait for the right moment for confrontation. Intuition was not enough. Discomfort was not enough. He wanted facts. He wanted certainties. He wanted to dismantle her mask before himself, before exposing her to the world, and with the same coldness with which he had already toppled billionaire competitors. He outlined the plan to uncover the truth behind the pregnancy. The first step was simple. He discreetly hired a private investigator, someone of absolute trust, one of those who knew how to move in the shadows without leaving traces. The order was clear and direct. Follow her every move, every medical appointment, every trip, every suspicious phone call. In little time, reports began to arrive. The investigator noted that many of the appointments she had announced never actually took place. She scheduled visits at renowned clinics, but never showed up. When questioned by him, she used rehearsed excuses: change of time, doctor unavailable, postponed tests. But behind the scenes, the cameras showed another reality: shopping trips, casual meetings with friends, outings that had nothing to do with health. The billionaire also decided to use his own methods. He began observing her as one would analyze a contract line by line. He mentally recorded the days she claimed to feel nausea, the moments she said she was weak, the excuses she gave not to accompany him to commitments. He noticed a pattern. The symptoms always appeared when he was around, as if staged for his exclusive audience. On occasions when he surprised her, he found her healthy, active, without a trace of the fatigue she so dramatically portrayed. This contrast was silent proof that the theatre was underway. The investigation reached its peak when the investigator brought something definitive: falsified documents, ultrasound exams with altered dates, stamps that did not match the cited clinics, reports copied from old files and adapted to look new. The fraud was blatant. He held the papers in his hands with the calm of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. He felt anger grow, not only for the lie, but for the fact that she had tried to use him in what mattered most: his honor, his legacy, his hidden desire to truly be a father. Still, he revealed nothing immediately. He decided to keep up the performance, looking at her as if he still believed every word, kissing her forehead when she said she was tired, caressing the false belly when in public she pretended to feel non-existent movements. Inside, however, he was already planning the confrontation. It would be devastating. calculated, irrefutable. He would not be satisfied with simply walking away. He wanted to expose the lie. He wanted her to feel the weight of the humiliation she had tried to impose on him. The billionaire whom the world admired as unattainable would now become the judge of a charade that was about to collapse. And while she reveled in the glory of her performance, believing she was closer than ever to consolidating the perfect scheme, she did not realize that the storm had already begun to form in his eyes. The investigation had come to an end, and the truth, sharp as a blade, was ready to be revealed. The day of the ultimate discovery was not marked by explosions or screams, but by a silence heavier than any word. The billionaire, already armed with all the evidence, sat in his vast living room, surrounded by windows that reflected the city like the empire he himself had built, and held in his hands the dossier delivered by the investigator. Each page was a calculated stab, medical exams with forged signatures, copied reports, falsified ultrasounds, intercepted conversations, revealing the cold manipulation of a woman willing to do anything. It was like watching a theatrical play dismantled behind the curtains, where the stage lights faded and only wires, smeared makeup, and exposed tricks remained. There, before him, lay the ultimate proof. The pregnancy had never existed. He did not explode in immediate fury. On the contrary, he took a deep breath and let the silence swallow the room. The man who had so often been betrayed in business, but had always found ways to win, now realized that in matters of the heart, he had also been the target of a dirty game. But there was a crucial difference. In business, betrayal was expected, part of the game. In love, or what should have been love, the lie struck more cruelly because it touched what he guarded in secret, the sincere desire to one day be a father. That desire, used as bait by her, had now transformed into restrained fury, into a cold determination that he would not allow the farce to go unpunished. When he looked at her for the first time, his eyes carried no spark of curiosity or veiled affection. They held the coldness of a judge who already knows the sentence before the trial begins. She, however, did not perceive it. She continued performing, caressing the false belly in front of mirrors, talking about possible baby names, sighing with feigned nausea whenever he was near. She believed she had victory in her hands, that she had already bound him definitively. What she did not know was that he had already crossed the line of doubt. Now he had certainty, and certainty has the power to transform the most patient of men into an implacable executioner. At that dinner, when she spoke for the 1,000th time about the imaginary child, he merely observed her in silence. Every word leaving her lips was another act of theatre he allowed to end before applauding ironically. But inside, he knew he was ready to turn the game around. It was no longer about suspicion or doubt. It was about fraud, crime, cruel manipulation. He, the man who had never accepted defeat at any negotiating table, now held in his hands the proof that he had been the target of one of life's worst deceptions. And the next step would not be merely to confront her. It would be to destroy her, to expose her, to make her feel every second of the humiliation she had tried to impose on him. The discovery of the scheme did not make him crumble. On the contrary, it strengthened in him the fury of a gladiator about to enter combat. The empire he had built with sweat and intelligence would not be stained by a cheap lie. The beautiful and dangerous woman who thought she was in control could scarcely imagine that from that moment on, every smile, every touch, every word would be nothing more than the prelude to her fall. The unattainable billionaire now not only knew of the charade, he was ready to crush her before everyone. The confrontation did not come immediately, but was prepared with the precision of someone who knows that revenge, to be perfect, requires a stage, an audience, and a set time. The billionaire did not want to face the scammer in just any moment. He wanted her completely disarmed before crushing her with the truth. Thus he maintained the theatre for a few more days, pretending to believe her words, praising her supposed care with the pregnancy, offering gifts, and even discussing the future as if it were real. Every gesture of his was an invisible rope that drew her deeper into her own lie, and she, enamored with her own performance, believed she was ever closer to victory. On the chosen night, he invited her to a luxurious dinner at his mansion, complete with a decorated table, gleaming crystal glasses, and an atmosphere that promised to be unforgettable. She, convinced that this would be the moment she received perhaps the marriage proposal that would consolidate her scheme, dressed like never before, an expensive gown he himself had bought, discreet yet gleaming jewelry, and the rehearsed smile of a woman who believed she had the world at her feet. She entered the room like an actress at the peak of her career, never imagining it would be her final scene. The billionaire received her calmly. His eyes, cold, betrayed nothing of the storm burning inside him. They sat at the table, exchanged light words, and she, at one point, once again caressed the false belly, speaking sweetly about baby names and the future awaiting them. He listened in silence. When he finally placed his glass on the table, he leaned slightly forward and said, with a grave and steady voice, "I know everything." The phrase, short as a hammer's blow, cut through the air and froze her smile. For an instant, the scammer tried to laugh, to deflect, to act as though she did not understand. But his eyes left no room for interpretation. They were sharp blades, reflecting absolute certainty. He stood, walked to a drawer, and returned with a folder of documents. He threw it onto the table, scattering the papers before her. Falsified exams, altered records, photographs taken by the investigator, undeniable evidence of each lie. With trembling hands, she flipped through each page, her arrogance replaced by despair. She tried to justify herself, said they were misunderstandings, that everything had explanations, but her voice faltered, caught in the knot of her own deceit. He, in contrast, did not raise his voice once. He spoke softly, with the cruel serenity of someone who does not need to shout to crush. "You thought you could deceive me, thought you could toy with the most sacred thing to me, but you were wrong. I was never the fragile target you imagined." The silence that followed was more devastating than any insult. She, lost, tried to approach him, touch his hand, beg for forgiveness, but he recoiled as one who repels something impure. His eyes said more than words: disgust, disappointment, restrained fury. The man the world believed untouchable now revealed himself as implacable, and before him, the woman who dreamed of glory crumbled like a house of cards. With every passing second, humiliation suffocated her more, and the confrontation was not merely between the two of them. It was between truth and lies, between honor and deceit. He no longer needed to prove anything to himself. Now, the next step would be to expose everything to the world. The billionaire would not be satisfied with ending the charade within the walls of his mansion. For him, the lie had been staged before the entire society, and it was before society that the scammer's mask should fall. That is why he planned a memorable night, but not to seal an engagement as everyone expected. Instead, he chose one of the greatest social events of the year, a charity gala organized by his own company, with the presence of businessmen, journalists, politicians, and influencers. The ballroom would be the perfect stage to reveal the truth, and the audience, composed of all those who believed in the performance, would be witness to the downfall of his false queen. She, of course, was invited with full pomp, believing she would be the star of the evening. She chose a stunning dress, tight enough to suggest the shape of months of pregnancy, and rehearsed maternal looks before the mirror. Upon entering the event by his side, the flashes burst. The cameras captured the perfect couple, and whispers spread. "She is the mother of the heir." Finally, he surrendered to love. This woman has conquered everything. She smiled with the confidence of someone who believed victory was absolute. The billionaire, however, maintained an enigmatic posture. He toasted with guests, posed for photos, but in his eyes lay a seriousness that few noticed at first. Until, at a certain moment in the evening, he took the stage. He grabbed the microphone, thanked everyone for their presence, and spoke about the value of truth, honor, and responsibility. His words echoed like riddles, and many still did not understand what was about to come. Then, in a calculated gesture, he called her to the stage, asking her to approach with a discreet smile. She walked toward him, believing she would receive, before everyone, the official announcement of an engagement. But at his side, her charade began to collapse. The billionaire opened a folder before the crowd and, in a firm voice, revealed that he had been the victim of a cruel lie. He presented the evidence: falsified exams, altered documents, undeniable proof. The ballroom plunged into absolute silence. She, trembling, tried to deny it, stammered justifications, but every word was drowned out by the avalanche of evidence he displayed. The audience, shocked, watched the fall of a woman who had deceived them all. Whispers spread, looks of contempt appeared, and the glamour she believed she had conquered turned into public shame. When he ended his speech, there were no applauses, only a heavy silence cut by glances of reproach and murmurs of scandal. The scammer, who believed she was at the top of the world, was now stripped of her lie before the entire society. She was taken from the stage in tears, no longer as the future mother of an heir, but as a revealed fraud. And while she was swallowed by her own shame, he stood tall, implacable, as the man who not only survived the scheme, but transformed humiliation into justice. The public humiliation would have been enough to ruin any reputation, but the billionaire did not want only to expose her. He wanted justice. The pregnancy scam was not just a personal lie. It was a meticulously calculated crime, an attempted fraud that involved falsified documents, altered reports, and manipulations that went far beyond the intimate sphere. He gathered all the evidence he already had in hand and delivered it to the authorities with the same coldness with which he signed million-dollar contracts. He asked for no favors, used no influence to hasten anything. He simply placed in the hands of the law a dossier that spoke for itself. She, still stunned by the abrupt fall of her empire of illusions, believed she could hide behind tears and public pity. She tried to maintain the discourse of a victim, claiming persecution, saying it was all a misunderstanding. But faced with forged exams, cloned signatures, incompatible dates, and even compromising audio recordings in which she spoke with accomplices about trapping the billionaire, there was no possible defense. The police knocked on her door in the early morning, in front of curious neighbors and sensationalist cameras, and the woman who once presented herself as the future mother of the heir was now handcuffed and placed inside a patrol car. The impact was devastating. Newspapers splashed the headline, "The Pregnancy Scam, Con Woman Arrested After Trying to Deceive Billionaire." Social media exploded with comments, memes, and outrage. People who once envied her now delighted in watching her downfall. Her image, which until recently gleamed as triumph, was now stained with shame, dishonor, and prison. And contrary to what she imagined, no one defended her. Friends distanced themselves, accomplices disappeared, and even family members refused to associate their names with the scandal. In court, before the judge, she tried to rehearse the same look of innocence she had so often used as a weapon. But there was no audience willing to applaud. The verdict was swift and implacable. Fraud, document forgery, attempted extortion. Sentenced to prison, she was taken away like any other criminal. And for the first time in her life, her beauty meant nothing. Inside the cold cell, before damp walls and rusty bars, she realized that the world she had tried to conquer with lies now saw her only as a dangerous and dishonored woman. The billionaire, meanwhile, did not attend the trial to testify. He didn't need to. He had already won. The justice he sought was not only legal, but moral, to show everyone that no one, no matter how calculating and seductive, could manipulate him with impunity. He continued with his life, firm, without looking back. The scammer's imprisonment was not only the end of the scheme, but the symbol that truth always prevails, even when lies seem to shine brighter for a few fleeting moments. The weight of the scandal still echoed in newspapers, on social media, and in whispered conversations, but within him there was a new silence, different from the solitude of before. It was the silence of liberation. For the first time in a long while, the billionaire breathed without feeling trapped in a web of manipulations. The discovery of the scam, the public exposure, and the scammer's imprisonment were not merely chapters of a well-executed revenge, but proof that even when the heart tries to deceive us, truth always finds a way to emerge. He now walked through the mansion not as a man deceived, but as someone who had regained control of his own life. The once cold walls seemed less heavy, for they no longer concealed a hidden lie. There were, of course, emotional scars, the wounded pride, the memory of each false word, the recollection of how, for a moment, he had believed he was about to become a father, but instead of turning into chains, These scars became armor. He had learned to distinguish true tenderness from manipulation, had learned that love is not performance, and that not every smile deserves trust. Society, which once whispered about his vulnerability, now revered him even more for his firmness in facing the farce head-on. In the eyes of the public, he had become not just a coveted billionaire, but an example of resilience, a man who was not destroyed by a lie, but who transformed it into strength. For her, all that remained was the cold cell, the echo of her own footsteps in a corridor stripped of glamour, her face printed in newspapers as a synonym for shame. The world she had believed she conquered dissolved like smoke, and the woman who dreamed of being queen was now just another prisoner. But for him, this ending was not pure vengeance, it was justice, and that justice brought him unexpected peace. The untouchable billionaire finally realized he did not need a supposed heir to validate his life. His true wealth lay in the freedom of being himself, without emotional shackles, without smiling deceptions. As he looked toward the horizon from the terrace of his mansion, with an upright body and a resolute expression, he felt that something within him had changed forever. The woman who had tried to deceive him had become nothing but a shadow in his journey, and at last, he was free to start again, stronger, more aware, more prepared to recognize true love if it ever appeared. The pregnancy scam had ended in prison, but for him, the outcome was far greater. It was the certainty that even in the face of the most well-crafted illusions, truth always triumphs, and that a man's heart, once freed from lies, can finally beat again with dignity.